And of course, we look at the business angle as well. Kate Moody is here for that, focusing on the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia in the past week and how effective they might be. Kate.
Well, Mark, the United States, the European Union, and their allies have been announcing measures that are designed to isolate and weaken the Russian economy. Now, a last major round of international sanctions was levied against Russia back in 2014 when it annexed Crimea. Since then, Vladimir Putin has been taking preemptive steps to try to protect the economy from any future sanctions. It's led to what some analysts have described as a fortress economy, one that's been adapted to survive just such a scenario. Now, for more, we can cross over and speak to Brian O'Toole, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, also a former Treasury Department official who focused on sanctions. Thanks for joining us on France 24 this evening. First, talk us through, if you will, some of the ways in which Russia has been preparing its economy to face more international sanctions.
Thanks for having me, Kate. As you said, they've built up a huge reserve of foreign exchange. Primarily, they've onshored a lot of their, or they've tried to onshore some production of things like food and other supplies that people need to consume. And they've reduced external debt. It's a country with very, very little foreign debt as compared to others. And to do this, they have sacrificed a tremendous amount of economic growth in the last 8 years. As you kind of noted with the sanctions over the weekend, Fortress Russia is gone. They have the U.S. and its G7 counterparts froze the assets effectively of the Russian central bank. And that essentially wipes out the liquid part of their foreign exchange and makes it really hard for them to bail out companies. It's been a pretty remarkable few days.
As you pointed out there, some of these sanctions have targeted Russian lenders, and in particular the Russian central bank. Can you help us understand the concrete impact of those kinds of moves on Russia's financial sector, but also on the government and the Russian public?
Yeah, absolutely. The banks themselves, right? The key banks that were targeted by the United States in particular were Sberbank and VTB, the two largest banks in Russia and far and away the most sophisticated banks in Russia. They have the most international links. U.S. sanctions in particular, I mean, it helps to have EU sanctions alongside, but U.S. sanctions in particular essentially cut them off from the rest of the world. They make cross-border transactions for those banks extraordinarily difficult and fundamentally alter the scope of the business that those banks are able to undertake. It is a blow you cannot prepare for. It is a blow you cannot counteract if you are relying on the external kind of third country business to sustain your bank. When it comes to the central bank, right, the central banks around the world are known as lenders of last resort. The U.S. has effectively crippled the Russian central bank along with its counterparts. And it's not just the G7, the Swiss are joining in and others, making Russia's foreign exchange reserves nearly inaccessible. What they have left are kind of Chinese bonds that aren't hugely convertible. They've got some cash in their vaults in Russia that's not going to help them defend the economy. And they have a whole bunch of gold. And gold is not the most liquid market in the world. There's a reason it hasn't been used as a means of exchange in 70 or 80 years. The financial system is very different from what Vladimir Putin and some of his closest cronies remember in the 1980s, and that's hurting them and the Russian people. Inflation is rising. Interest rates got spiked on Monday morning by the Russian central bank from 9.5% to 20%. There are capital controls that have been instituted, and Russian companies and perhaps the Russian sovereign will soon be in default on their external debt. Those are all terrible economic and financial indicators, and it points to a huge drop in the Russian economy coming up very soon.
So you think the sanctions that have been levied so far are fairly effective against the financial industry? There has been a lot of focus on this decision to cut off a number of Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system. That's something that makes it more complicated but not impossible for them to conduct international transactions. How effective do you think that specific move is? How significant is it?
It's more politically significant than anything else, right? This was something that President Zelensky and others, including the U.S. Congress, have really harped in on as much for the symbolic value that as anything else. As a practical matter, the sanctions, right, the cutoff of transactions is what matters when you're talking about sanctioning banks. Preventing them from accessing the SWIFT network makes their transactions with other parties, whether that's China or India or others, more difficult and more complicated. But that's kind of like cleanup work after you've imposed the real brunt of sanctions, which is, VTB, you may no longer deal with the United States or Europe. That is a much bigger blow than the SWIFT cutoff, but there was certainly some symbolic importance in cutting them off from SWIFT, and sometimes that's not to be underestimated. Symbols matter.
Brian, I'm Mark Owen. I'm alongside Kate here in the studio. I was just wondering, is there any around these sanctions? Because is there some kind of parallel system that the Russians could take advantage of to sort of, bypass the SWIFT system?
There are other settlement networks for sure that they can tap into. I mean, the Russians have their own. The Chinese have a domestic system. Neither of those are cross-border at the moment. They could send emails and things like that. You could use telex. That's actually still in use. These things are all difficult, right? They're not. It's not to undermine, or kind of not to underestimate the impact of it. It definitely has an impact, but it's far different from being told, you can't use this messaging platform versus you can't transact with us, period. Right. And that's where the U.S. and Europe have focused, rightfully so, is on the transactions piece. And now the Europeans, I think, are, as you've seen this morning, are kind of putting the SWIFT piece of it in place too, to kind of, it helps, as I said, clean up the last remaining vestiges of their transactions with third country jurisdictions. And it also has a symbolic effect of cutting them off from this globally important network.
Indeed, Brian. So the fact that Russia is doing business to its east as well as having done it to its west, it isn't going to be enough to actually sort of palliate that problem, to get past this sanction that the SWIFT thing represents.
Well, look, if it was just SWIFT, they would find a way to do it, right? If it was SWIFT and not a cutoff of transactions, they would find a way around that to continue transacting. That I have no doubt of. The real hammer blow here is the cutoff of transactions. When you lose access to New York City, essentially, in conducting cross-border transactions where you have to exchange one currency for another to make the transaction happen, you are essentially cut off from the global financial system. You're a pariah. And that's what's going to happen. That's what is happening to VTB and Sberbank at the moment. There's no way around that, period. New York City has a gravity in the international financial system that is not even approached by any other place in the world, even Beijing, which has a lot of money but does not have the same financial flows. New York City turns over on average something like $15 to $17 trillion every single day. JP Morgan publishes that they themselves clear about $5 to $7 trillion in transactions daily. So that bank by themselves in New York is running US GDP through its systems basically every third or fourth day, which is just a remarkable amount of money. No place else does that.
Brian, back in 2014, you were working at the U.S. Treasury Department, so you were involved in that decision-making process for that last round of sanctions. How much of the calculations that are going on in Washington, in Brussels, in other capitals is about finding this balance of really targeting and hitting Russia's economy while protecting their own domestic economies? Yeah,
that's always a key. I tend to put it pithily that you want to hurt the other guy more than yourself when you're imposing sanctions. And so that's why you see carve-outs for energy and things like that. But I think, given the threat here is a really different threat than we faced in 2014, there is an increased tolerance, or at least kind of acceptance of spillover to Western economies of these actions. And I think that's a really important component here. It's important to remember for folks out there that Ukraine is not the end of Putin's goals. And that's a really scary thing when you start talking about NATO, conflicts with NATO and other expansion that Putin may have in mind. And that's one of the reasons it seems that the West collectively is willing to kind of absorb more of a hit to their economies than maybe we all were in 2014.
Brian O'Toole from the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for your insight on France 24 this evening.
Happy to join you. Thanks.
Mark, I'll be back later on in the evening with more business news, including the stock markets and a lot of big movements for oil prices today.